In the Arizona Territory, in the year 1878, the wind did not ask permission. It ruled. It swept down from the high mesas and scoured the single street of San Miguel, carrying alkali dust that tasted like failure. San Miguel was a town built of sun-baked adobe and desperation, a stopover on the long cattle drives and a waypoint for the salt caravans moving south. The sun owned the day, baking the ground into a cracked plate, but the desert night belonged to a cold that found every gap in the wood and every thinness in the blanket. Clara Reyes was 20 years old, and she knew that cold intimately. She sat hunched by the light of a single kerosene lamp, her needle moving with a speed that defied the stiffness in her fingers. Her world was this small, rented room behind the tannery, a place that smelled of lye from her laundry work and bitter herbs from her apothecary bundles. She was an orphan, but she was not alone. She was the sole anchor for her brother, Luis, and her sister, Marisol. Luis was 12, a boy with quiet eyes, reading a worn copy of a dime novel by the weak light of the cook fire. Marisol was 8. She lay on the pallet, coughing, a dry, thin sound that cut Clara deeper than the wind. The cough was why Clara worked so late. Marisol needed a warm coat. The rent for the room was due on Monday. Clara held up the dress she was mending. It was silk, a deep blue, and it belonged to the wife of the mercantile owner. Clara's skill with a needle was the only thing that kept her family from starvation. She laundered, she mended, and she gathered plants in the foothills for the town's doctor, selling her knowledge of herbs for pennies. Her hands were red and raw from the lye, the knuckles swollen, but her stitches were nearly invisible. This job was late. It had been promised for Sunday morning, to be delivered at the church service itself, a fact that tightened Clara's stomach. The town of San Miguel was governed by a sharp, unspoken set of rules. Power belonged to the merchants, the landowners, and the mayor. Their wives and daughters set the tone. Prejudice was not a loud, angry thing. It was a quiet sorting. It was in the way the preacher paused when Clara dropped her few coins in the collection plate. It was in the silence that fell when an Apache rider entered the general store. Toma Nantan was that rider. He was a Chiricahua Apache, a man who owned the sprawling Rancho Nantan north of town. He was wealthy, but he lived by rules the town did not entirely understand. He was known for his fairness and for a severe, quiet sense of honor. He rode into San Miguel not with the noise, but with presence. His horse was a dark bay, powerful and clean, and he dismounted with a fluid motion. He was in town for supplies, his wagon waiting. He was raising his brother's 2 orphaned sons, and his list was practical. Flour, coffee, beans, ammunition. At the counter, he added 2 small sacks of peppermint candies. The storekeeper was polite. He was polite to Toma's money and to the reputation of his ranch, which provided more beef to the territory than any other. But there was always a space around Toma, a boundary of air the townsfolk did not cross. He spoke little, his voice low. He paid in coin and watched his goods being loaded, his gaze missing nothing. From the saloon across the street, Vince Malloy watched him. Vince had once been Toma Nantan's trail boss, a position of power. He had been fired 3 months prior. The official reason was negligence. The rumor, whispered over whiskey, was short counts on the cattle tally. Now Vince was a man defined by what he had lost. He was broad-shouldered and dark, his mood as sour as the stale beer in the air. He nursed a drink, his eyes fixed on the Apache rancher. He was rumored to have connections to the rustlers that plagued the smaller ranches, but no one said it to his face. The world of the ranch had its own laws, different from the town's. It was a life of cattle and long trails, of knowing the location of every well and the mood of every horse. It was the smoke of the cook fire before dawn and the vigilance at the forge. The highest law was unspoken. You handled your own trouble, and you did not shame another man in public. Vince Malloy felt Toma had broken that rule. He felt shamed. Clara bundled the herbs for the apothecary. the sharp scent of creosote and sage filling her small room. She needed the coins from the delivery to buy flour. As she stepped onto the street, the wind hit her, forcing her to pull her thin shawl tighter. She hurried past the dressmaker's shop. Inside, framed by the lamplight, stood Celia Marsh, the mayor's daughter. She was beautiful, with sharp features and hair the color of corn silk. She was holding a bolt of new fabric against her shoulder, laughing with her friends. Her eyes, bright and intelligent, swept the street and landed on Clara. The laughter did not stop, but it changed. Her gaze slid over Clara's patched dress and worn boots. It was not hatred. It was worse. It was dismissal. It was the look a person gives an object that is in the wrong place. Clara felt the familiar heat rise in her neck. She lowered her gaze and walked on. Celia was the center of San Miguel society. Clara was the dust on its boots. Clara made her delivery and collected her coins. It was not enough for the rent and a coat. It was barely enough for flour. Her immediate worry was the mending. The Sunday deadline loomed. Delivering the dress at the church meant walking in front of everyone, in front of Celia, to hand over the finished work. In the saloon, the talk turned, as it often did, to danger. A rancher from the south spoke in a low voice. "The night comets," he said, naming the phantom gang of rustlers. "They hit the Dry Creek line station. Took 50 head. Another man shook his head. "Just talk. They do not come this far north." "They do now." The first man said, "My riders found the tracks. They move fast. They are ghosts." Vince Malloy listened from his corner, his expression unreadable. The night comets were a shadow stretching toward the valley, and every ranch, especially the prosperous Rancho Nantan, was suddenly wary. Clara returned to her room. The fire was low. Luis was asleep, his book resting on his chest. Marisol was stirring, her breathing shallow. Clara checked the money jar. $2 short for the rent, and nothing for the coat. She sat down again under the lamp, picking up the blue silk dress. She looked at her own hands, the calluses and cracks. She felt a familiar despair, but something else beneath it. It was pride. It was the stubborn belief that her work had value, belonging. Clara thought, was not about the clothes you wore or the house you lived in. It was about how you stood when the wind tried to knock you down. She threaded the needle. The wind howled outside, but in the small room, there was only the sound of the needle passing through silk. A quiet, steady fight against the cold. Sunday arrived cold and bright, the light of a high desert morning that polished the sky but offered no heat. Clara had stayed awake until nearly 2 a.m, her fingers stiff, her eyes burning. But the blue silk dress was finished. The stitches were invisible, the tear at the hem a memory. She wrapped it in a piece of clean linen she had saved. She woke Luis and Marisol before dawn. She dressed Marisol in her only other dress and combed her dark hair, tying it back with a scrap of yarn. Luis, quiet and watchful, pulled on his boots, his face serious. He knew today was a trial. Clara saved her own preparations for last. She wore her one church dress, a gray cotton faded from countless washings. It was clean, but it was thin. She looked at her shawl lying on the stool. It was her only warm wrap, a heavy wool that had once belonged to her mother, but it was a map of their poverty. She had mended it so many times, using scraps of other wool, that it was a patchwork of brown, gray, and dark blue. It was ugly, but it was warm. Marisol was still coughing. Clara put the shawl on, pulling it tight. Luis carried the wrapped dress. Clara held Marisol's hand. They walked through the quiet streets, the sound of the single church bell calling the town to worship. The churchyard was already full of buggies and horses. The wealthy families of San Miguel stood near the adobe entrance, greeting each other, their Sunday clothes a bright display of wool, velvet, and silk. Clara's stomach tightened. She had 2 duties. First, she had to find Mr. Eames, the deacon. and pay the 50 cents they owed for the right to sit on the hard bench at the very back of the church. Second, she had to find Mrs. Hollander and deliver the blue dress. Both required her to walk through the heart of the town's social circle. She saw Mr. Eames near the door, a ledger in his hand. Keeping her eyes low, she navigated the children around a group of men discussing cattle prices. "Mr. Eames," she said, her voice small. He turned, his expression stern. He looked down at the coins in her palm. He took them, counted them slowly, and made a mark in his book. "Reyes, 2 children," he said, more to the book than to her. He nodded, dismissing her. Clara felt a wave of relief, but it came too soon. "Why, Clara Reyes, I am surprised you bothered to come." The voice was Celia Marsh's. It was clear and bright as the cold air, and it carried. The conversations around them paused. Clara turned. Celia stood there, framed by her friends, looking magnificent in a dark green velvet coat with a matching hat. "Good morning, Miss Marsh," Clara said, trying to move past. Celia stepped into her path. "You are delivering Mrs. Hollander's dress, I assume after making her wait." "It is finished," Clara said, her hand tightening on Marisol's. Celia's eyes, a sharp blue, left Clara's face and scanned her, stopping at the shawl. A small, cruel smile touched her lips. "My goodness, what exactly is that you are wearing?" Clara felt the heat rise in her face. "It is my shawl." "Your shawl," Celia laughed, a light, tinkling sound that invited her friends to join. "It looks like something you pulled from a rag bin. Let me see." Before Clara could react, Celia reached out with her gloved fingers and snatched the shawl. She did not just take it, she tugged it, pulling Clara off balance. "Celia, do not," one of her friends said, suddenly nervous. But Celia was enjoying herself. She held the shawl up between her thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. "Look at this," she announced to the silent yard. "Is this a patch from a horse blanket or just floor sweepings?" The laughter that followed was louder this time. Clara stood exposed, her thin gray dress offering no defense against the cold or the stares. Luis stepped partly in front of Marisol, his small face tight with anger he could not show. "Please," Clara whispered, reaching for it. "Give it back." "Oh, you actually want this thing?" Celia's voice was filled with false surprise. "It is disgusting. It is nothing but Tucson trash." And with a flick of her wrist, she tossed the shawl. It landed in the fine, pale dust of the churchyard, a crumpled heap of mended wool. The laughter stopped abruptly, cut off as if by a knife. The silence that fell was heavy, absolute. Clara stared at the shawl, that piece of her mother, lying in the dirt. She was frozen. She could not breathe. To pick it up was to accept the ultimate humiliation. To leave it was impossible. A man moved. He had been standing quietly by his wagon at the edge of the churchyard, his 2 young nephews at his side. He had been invisible to the social gathering, just another shadow. Now, he was not. Toma Nantan walked into the center of the silent circle. He walked directly past Celia Marsh, his gaze not even brushing her. He stopped and looked down at the shawl. The entire town watched. The Apache rancher, the man who kept to himself. He stood over the shawl for a long moment. Then, slowly, he bent at the waist and picked it up. He held it in his large, brown hands. He did not look at Clara. He looked at the shawl itself. He studied the patches, the hundreds of tiny stitches. Then, with a deliberate, smooth motion, he shook the dust from it. Once, twice. The small cloud of alkali dust vanished on the wind. He turned to Clara. She looked up at him, her body trembling. His face was severe, carved by sun and wind, his black hair tied back. He stepped toward her, and she flinched. He did not touch her skin. He lifted the shawl, opened it, and settled it back onto her shoulders. His hands, rough from leather and work, brushed the collar of her dress as he squared it. The gesture was impersonal, practical, and yet more profound than any touch she had ever known. He stepped back and finally looked at Celia Marsh. His voice was not loud. It was low, deep, and it cut through the silence of the yard. "There is more value," he said, his words precise, "in the labor that mended this shawl." His gaze dropped to the patches. "Than in a heart that has never had to endure a single hardship." He looked back at Clara. His eyes did not travel to her face. They moved to her hands, which were clutched together at her waist. He saw the red, raw knuckles, the calluses, the needle pricks. He looked at her hands for a full 3 seconds. It was not pity. It was not kindness. It was recognition. It was respect. At the church door, the preacher cleared his throat and gave a single, emphatic nod. Celia Marsh's face was a mask of furious red. Her mouth opened, then snapped shut. She had been publicly judged and found wanting, not by a social equal, but by an Apache. She was speechless, with a sound that was half sob, half rage. She turned and stormed into the church, her friends scattering like quail behind her. The spell was broken. The crowd dissolved, people murmuring, moving quickly into the building, their eyes darting glances at Clara, at Toma, at the empty space where Celia had stood. Clara stood, rooted to the spot, the shawl heavy and warm on her shoulders. She wanted to say thank you, but her throat was closed. The habit of silence, of absorbing pain without comment, was too strong. But beneath the layers of shock and shame, a single, new feeling was rising. It was the breathtaking possibility of being seen. He had not seen a beggar. He had not seen trash. He had seen her work. Toma Nantan held her gaze for one more second. He nodded, a small, final gesture. Then he turned, walked back to his wagon, and his nephews fell into step beside him. "Clara never found Mrs. Hollander." She grabbed her children's hands and walked away from the church, back to the safety of their small, cold room. She did not hear the sermon. By noon, the story was the only thing spoken of in San Miguel. It was told in the saloon, over the counter at the mercantile, and behind the closed doors of the town's houses. Heard what happened at the church. The Apache, Nantan, he stepped right up to the mayor's daughter, defended that little laundry girl, picked her shawl right out of the dust. In the saloon, Vince Malloy listened, his expression sour. "Maybe Nantan is looking for a new pet," he sneered into his whiskey. But the freighter next to him shook his head. "No, that is not his way. I have driven for him. He is a fair man. He does not like waste. And he does not like public shame. He just called it as he saw it." "He shamed Celia Marsh," another man muttered, and there was a note of quiet awe in his voice. "Right in front of the preacher." Toma's reputation for quiet, unbending honor settled more firmly into place. Some mocked him. Most respected him. Clara heard the echoes of it when she forced herself to go to the mercantile for flour late that afternoon. She needed it for bread. The storekeeper, who usually just grunted at her, actually nodded. "Afternoon, Miss Reyes." His wife looked up from her sewing and watched her. Clara felt her skin prickle. She was no longer invisible. She was the girl the Apache rancher had defended. She did not know if this was better or worse than being ignored. She bought her flour and was counting her few remaining coins on the porch, her mind calculating. Still not enough for the rent. Still nothing for Marisol's coat. She heard two women talking as they loaded supplies into a buggy. "He is still looking, you know," one said, tying a sack. "Who is Toma Nantan? He is looking for a woman, a house steward." The other woman sniffed. "Go all the way out there to the Rancho Nantan, live with his people and those two wild boys? I would not. The pay is real. Martha, a full wage. But he is particular. Rosa, his cook, she is a dragon, and he wants someone to teach the boys their letters. He wants a decent woman." The first woman sighed. climbing into the buggy. "Well, he will not find one in this town. He was talking to the doctor last week. He said he needs someone he can trust. Someone, he said, who understands the value of hard work." Clara stopped breathing. The coins were cold in her hand. Someone trustworthy. Someone who understands the value of hard work. The words dropped into her mind, landing on the memory of the morning, the memory of his dark eyes. Not looking at her face, but looking at her hands. A wild, terrifying, impossible idea began to form. It was a spark in the cold, and she was afraid of it, but she could not look away. The idea of the job at Rancho Nantan was a dangerous seed. Clara tried to push it from her mind as she walked back to her room, the sack of flour a heavy weight against her hip. The rumors were one thing. The reality of acting on them was another. To go to him would be to confirm every whisper. It would be to tie herself to the Apache rancher in the town's mind. A relationship they would immediately define in the ugliest terms. She would be seen as a kept woman, not a hired hand. The humiliation she felt in the churchyard would become a permanent stain. She could not. She would find another way. She would ask for more mending, work longer hours, sell more herbs. She fed Luis and Marisol a thin soup of beans and corn, and put them to bed. Marisol's cough was looser, but it was still there, a small, rattling sound in the dark. Clara sat by the low fire, calculating. The rent was due tomorrow. She was $2 short. She had no other work, no one else to ask. The blue silk dress was still in her room, undelivered, unpaid for, Mrs. Hollander. In her anger at Celia's display, had left the church and would not be reachable until Monday. Clara felt the walls closing in. The fear was a cold, solid thing in her stomach. She had one last option. She sometimes used a neighbor's small, rickety wagon to deliver her heaviest laundry loads or to go far into the foothills for the rarest herbs. Her neighbor, a widower who worked at the tannery, let her borrow it for a few cents. She had a bundle of dried herbs she had been saving, hoping for a better price from the doctor. She could not wait. If she took them to him tonight, to his home, he might pay her. It was a desperate chance. The doctor was a creature of habit and did not like his routines broken. She bundled the herbs. She woke Luis. "I have to go out," she whispered. "I cannot leave Marisol." Luis was awake instantly, his eyes clear. "We will come with you. It is too cold and late." "We will not stay alone," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He was already pulling his sister's thin coat onto her sleeping form. Clara's heart ached. She wrapped Marisol in the mended patchwork shawl, the one Toma Nantan had lifted from the dust. She settled her into the back of the small wagon, piling empty burlap sacks around her for warmth. Luis sat beside her, his arm around his sister. Clara took the reins. The town was dark. The saloons were still bright, casting yellow squares of light onto the street, but the rest of San Miguel was asleep. The wind was rising again, a high, thin sound that came from the mountains. It picked up sand and grit, stinging her face. She made it to the doctor's house. The windows were dark. She knocked, her knuckles rapping against the solid wood. She waited. She knocked again. Louder. A window opened above her. The doctor's head appeared, a white nightcap on. "Who is it? What do you want at this hour?" "It is Clara Reyes. Doctor, I have the herbs you wanted. The feverfew." "It is nearly midnight, girl," he shouted down, his voice thick with anger and sleep. "I will see you on Tuesday. Go away." "Please, doctor, I need the money tonight." "Go away," he roared. The window slammed shut, the sound final. Clara stood on the step, defeated. The wind whipped her hair across her face. She felt tears of frustration, hot and angry, freeze on her cheeks. She turned and walked back to the wagon. "It is all right, Clara," Luis whispered. "We will go home." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She climbed onto the wagon seat and turned the old mule back toward their room behind the tannery. They had to pass the north gate to get there, the road that led out of town toward the high plains and the Rancho Nantan. The wind was a physical force here, howling through the gap in the low hills. The wagon creaked and groaned. Then, with a sickening lurch, the wagon tilted violently to the left. A terrible scraping sound of wood on hard-packed earth filled the air. The mule stopped, pulling against the sudden drag. Marisol cried out, startled from her sleep. "What is it?" Clara said, her voice sharp with panic. She pulled the weak handbrake and jumped down. Luis was right behind her, grabbing the lantern. He held the light low. The front left wheel was canted at an impossible angle, its top leaning in, its bottom splayed out. "The pin," Luis said, his voice trembling. "The linchpin is gone. It must have rattled loose." Clara's heart stopped. She knelt in the dust, the wind tearing at her dress. He was right. The heavy pin that held the wheel onto the axle was gone. Lost somewhere in the dark road behind them. The wheel was held on by nothing but its own weight. They were stranded. "The blacksmith," Clara said, her mind racing. "He lives behind the smithy." "It is dark. Clara, he will be like the doctor," Luis said, his voice old. "We have to try." She looked back at Marisol, who was coughing, frightened by the cold and the lurching stop. The blacksmith shop was 2 streets back, but it felt like a mile. "Stay with her," Clara said. "I will be fast." She ran, her boots slipping in the sand. The smithy was a black shape against the slightly less black sky. She pounded on the door. "Mr. Hatcher, please, my wagon has broken. My children are cold." There was no answer, only the sound of the wind. She pounded until her fist was bruised and her throat was raw from shouting his name. Nothing. He was gone, or he was a heavy sleeper, or he simply did not care. She trudged back to the wagon, each step a fresh wave of despair. Luis stood by the broken wheel, holding the lantern high, a small, lonely figure. "He did not come," Clara said, her voice flat. They were stuck, here at the edge of town, where the wind was worst, with a sick child and no help. She leaned her head against the rough wood of the wagon. She would have to unhitch the mule, get the children, and walk home, leaving the wagon. She would face her neighbor's anger tomorrow, and she would face the landlord with no rent money. This was it. This was the end of the line. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the road. It was not a sound that alerted her. It was a presence. Luis saw him first and stiffened, his hand grabbing Clara's arm. Clara looked up. A man on a horse was standing 20 feet away, watching them. He was perfectly still. "You have trouble," he said. The voice was low and familiar. "Mr. Nantan," Clara breathed. Her heart, which had been a cold stone, suddenly began to beat in a painful, rapid rhythm. Toma Nantan dismounted. He moved without a sound. He had been riding his northern fence line, checking for breaks from the wind or from rustlers. He walked up to the wagon, his gaze taking in the scene in one sweep: the tilted wheel, the lantern, Clara's pale face, the 2 children huddled in the back. "The linchpin," he said. It was not a question. "It is gone," Luis said, his voice small. Toma walked to the broken wheel. He squatted down, his strong legs easily taking his weight. The lantern light caught the high planes of his face and the silver conchos on his hatband. He was close. Clara was standing so near she could smell the scent of sage and horse and clean leather that clung to him. She could hear the quiet, steady rhythm of his breathing. "Give me the light," he said. Clara handed him the lantern, their fingers brushing. His hand was calloused and warm, even in the cold. She pulled her hand back as if burned. He held the light to the axle. "It is not damaged. The hub is intact." He reached to his saddle, which was slung with tools and rope. He came back with a heavy iron pin from his kit. He looked at Clara. "You will need to know this," he said. He did not offer to do it for her. He offered to show her. He put the lantern on the ground, where it cast a circle of yellow light. He knelt, positioning the heavy pin. "Put your hand here," he said, pointing to the end of the pin. Clara hesitated, then knelt beside him in the dust. The wind whipped her hair around her face, and she had to push it back. She placed her small, chapped hand on the cold iron. His hand, large and dark, covered hers. He did not push. He simply guided. "Feel the hole in the axle," he said, his voice a low rumble beside her ear. "You must align them. So—" He moved her hand, and she felt the metal slide into the groove. "Now push." She pushed. The pin slid into place, solid and secure. He showed her how to drop the smaller locking key that would keep it from rattling free. "You keep a good house," he said, his voice quiet, still focused on the work. "A wagon is a house when the night is cold." He stood up, and Clara rose with him, her legs unsteady. She was trembling, but not from the cold. She was trembling from the shock of his presence, from the simple, profound respect of his lesson. "I do not," she started. "I cannot pay you for this." "It is not a debt," he said. He looked at her, his eyes dark in the lantern light. "Come to the Rancho Nantan in the morning. If you want the work, I will offer fair terms. Bring the children." The words hung in the air. The rumor she had heard, the job, it was real. He was offering it to her. All her fears returned in a rush. The whispers, the shame, what Vince Malloy had called her, what Celia would say. To accept was to be ruined in one way. To refuse was to be ruined in another. She looked at his hand, then at her own, still grimy from the axle. She looked at the wheel, now solid and straight. She had been a part of this. He had not just saved her. He had taught her. She started, but she could not find the words. She did not know what to say. Toma Nantan watched her face. He saw the war in her, the pride fighting the fear. He did not press her. He did not ask for an answer. He had made the offer. The choice was hers. He bent, picked up the lantern, and handed it back to her. Their hands touched again. A brief, accidental brushing of skin and metal. It was not a flirtation. It was a current of pure trust, a spark that lit the dark space between them. He nodded, a gesture as final as the one in the churchyard. "The pin will hold," he said. He turned, swung up onto his horse in one fluid motion, and looked down at her one last time. Then, without another word, he turned the horse and dissolved back into the night, the sound of his hoofbeats quickly eaten by the wind. Clara stood by the wagon, the lantern in her hand, its light suddenly feeling much warmer. She was still cold, she was still poor, and she still had no rent money, but the wagon was fixed, and a foundation stone had been laid in the desert night. She had a choice. The sun rose on Monday, the day the rent was due. Clara had not slept. She had sat in the dark, the lantern long since extinguished, listening to the wind and the rattling cough from Marisol. The choice Toma Nantan had offered her was impossible. To go to him was to invite a kind of ruin she had always fought to avoid. To stay was to face a ruin that was certain. When the first light touched the cracked adobe wall, she stood up. Her body was stiff. She looked at her sleeping children. Her decision was not a decision at all. It was a simple acknowledgement of the facts. She had no money, she had no food, she had no options. She began to pack. It did not take long. A spare dress for herself, and one for Marisol. Luis's extra shirt, her herbs, Luis's single, worn book, the mended shawl. She wrapped it all in a bedroll. A hard knock came at the door. It was Mr. Sykes, the landlord, a man whose patience was as thin as his hair. "Miss Reyes," he said, not unkindly. "It is the first of the month." Clara stood in the open doorway, the bundle at her feet. "I do not have it, Mr. Sykes. We will be gone by noon." He looked surprised, his gaze flicking to the bundle, then back to her face. He had expected begging or tears. Gone, gone where? Clara lifted her chin. The words felt strange and heavy on her tongue. I have accepted a position as house steward at the Rancho Nantan. Mr. Sykes's eyebrows disappeared into his hairline. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The social implications of her statement were vast, and he was already calculating the gossip, but it also solved his problem. Well, he said, clearing his throat. I see. Then I will bid you good day. He tipped his hat, a gesture of confused respect, and left. Clara let out a breath she did not know she was holding. She woke the children. We are leaving, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Where are we going? Luis asked, his eyes wide, sensing the gravity. To a new job, north of town. The walk was long. She led them out of the north gate, past the spot on the road where the wagon wheel had failed. The road to the Rancho Nantan was little more than a cattle track, and the sun was already high, beating down on them. Marisol stumbled, and Luis, without a word, tried to help her, though he was not much bigger. Clara eventually had to carry her, shifting her weight from hip to hip, the bundle digging into her back. They walked for more than an hour, the town vanishing behind them, the world opening up into a vast, empty expanse of mesquite and red rock. The Rancho Nantan appeared suddenly. It was not a single grand house, but a long, low compound of adobe buildings that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. The fences were strong, the corrals were full, and smoke rose from the chimney of a separate cookhouse. It was a place of work, not display. As they walked up the main path, the ranch went quiet. Cowboys mending tack in the shade of the barn stopped their work. Their faces were hard to read, a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Clara felt their eyes on her, 100 times heavier than the sun. She saw no other women, save for a glimpse of an older Apache woman stirring a pot in the cookhouse. Toma Nantan emerged from the blacksmith's forge, wiping his hands on a rag. He wore work clothes, no different from his men, but he moved with an authority that needed no badge. He saw her, and his face registered no surprise, as if he had known she would come. He waited for her on the porch of the main house. Clara stopped in front of him, putting Marisol down. Her children flanked her, their hands clutching her skirt. Mr. Nantan, she said, her voice dry from dust and fear. Miss Reyes, he replied. I have come, she said, to hear the terms of the position. She had rehearsed this. She would not be a refugee. She would be an employee. I will work, she stated, her voice shaking but gaining strength. I will not accept charity. My children will stay with me, and they must be taught their letters, and I require a clear wage for my labor. Toma Nantan looked at her. He saw the dust on her face, the desperation she was trying so hard to hide, and the unbending line of her pride. He gave a single nod. These are the terms, he said, his voice as practical as the ranch around them. You will have the room adjoining the kitchen. It has 2 beds. You and your family will eat from the kitchen. Your duties are the stores, the pantry, and the running of this house. He gestured to the main building. You will also teach the children, mine and yours. All 4? Clara asked, glancing at 2 young Apache boys who had appeared in a doorway, watching her with silent, dark eyes. All 4, reading, writing, and numbers, for 3 hours every morning, before the noon meal. The pay is $30 a month, paid on the 1st. Clara could not breathe. $30. It was a fortune. It was more than she could make in 6 months of washing and mending. It was life. There is one more thing, he said, his voice dropping. This is my home. We honor the customs of my people here. The fire is respected. Water is never wasted. You will find that we value silence. I understand, Clara whispered. Good. He turned his head toward the cookhouse. Rosa. The woman Clara had seen earlier emerged. She was older, her face a map of wrinkles, her hair in 2 gray braids. She was Apache, and she radiated an authority that was equal to Toma's. This was her domain. She walked up to Clara and looked her over, from her worn boots to her chapped hands to the 2 children hiding behind her. Her expression was not welcoming. It was wary. She was the guardian of his house, and Clara was an outsider, a white girl from the town. "This is Miss Reyes," Toma said. "She will manage the house and the stores." Rosa just grunted. "We will see," she said. She turned to Clara. "Come, I show you." The room was small, but it was clean, and it had real beds with thick wool blankets. Marisol, exhausted, immediately curled up on one and fell asleep. Rosa then led Clara to the pantry. It was a large, cool room, but it was chaos. Sacks of flour, beans, coffee, and sugar were piled haphazardly. Tins of peaches were mixed with tins of lard. "This," Rosa said, sweeping her hand, "is your job. I cook, you count, the men eat, you make sure there is enough." The challenge was clear. Rosa did not believe she could do it. That first week, Clara felt she was being tested every minute. The cowboys, 10 in all, filed in for meals, their spurs ringing on the floor. They stared at her. She heard one of them mutter to another, "That is the one Nantan fetched from the churchyard, the laundry girl." Another man laughed. "Looks like she is Nantan's new project." Clara kept her eyes down. She served the coffee, her hands steady. She cleared the plates. She did not speak unless spoken to. She just worked. She began in the pantry. She found a ledger book and a piece of charcoal. She took a full inventory of every item. She swept the floor. She found weevils in a half-empty sack of flour and, without asking for help, dragged the heavy sack outside for the chickens. She reorganized everything, stacking the tins, arranging the sacks by date. She created order from chaos. Rosa watched her. She said nothing. But on the 3rd day, when Clara presented her with a clean, itemized list of what they had and what they needed from town, Rosa looked at the neat columns, and her expression softened by a fraction. The lessons were the next trial. Toma's nephews, Nakai and Taza, were 9 and 11. They were wild and spoke almost no English. They regarded her with open suspicion. On the first morning, she sat them on the porch with Luis and Marisol. She brought out a slate. The boys looked ready to bolt. Clara did not try to make them sit still. She drew a picture. It was a simple, clear drawing of a horse. She pointed to it. "Horse," she said. Nakai said the Apache word for it. Luis, catching on, pointed to himself. "Luis." Taza pointed to his brother. "Nakai." Clara drew a picture of a cow, then a fire, then a tree. By the end of the hour, Nakai had snatched the charcoal from her hand and drawn a crude picture of a snake, looking at her expectantly. "Snake," Clara said, and the boy laughed. The evenings became the center of their new life. After the supper, things were cleaned. The cowboys retired to the bunkhouse. The main house grew quiet. Rosa would sit by the large central hearth, smoking a small clay pipe. Toma would be in his chair, mending a bridle or oiling a rifle, present but silent. Clara sat on a stool, her hands busy, not with paid mending, but with the ranch's needs. She was darning a sock for Luis. At first, the children were separate, but soon, Luis, seeing the other boys' boredom, took out his dime novel. He began to read aloud, his voice gaining confidence. He told the story of a Texas Ranger tracking bandits. When he saw Nakai and Taza watching, he began to point to the pictures, acting out the parts. Soon, all 4 children were huddled together by the fire. Marisol's cough almost gone, the boys hanging on Luis's every word. The kitchen, once just a place to feed hungry men, was becoming a home. The hearth was its heart. Toma watched it all from his shadow, his face unreadable, but his eyes were on the children. and on Clara's hands as they moved, stitching their small world together. This new fragile piece was not safe. The outside world was always pressing in. One afternoon, a rider from a neighboring ranch pounded into the yard. His horse lathered. He spoke in low, urgent tones with Toma. That night, the mood at supper was grim. "What is it?" one of the older cowboys asked. "A night comets," Toma said, his voice flat. "They hit the line station at Dry Creek. Took more than 20 head." A silence fell on the table. Dry Creek was only a day's ride away. "They're getting bold," the cowboy said. In San Miguel, the talk was not of rustlers, but of Clara. Vince Malloy sat in his usual corner of the saloon, nursing a whiskey. "Heard Nantan finally got himself a woman," a freighter said, nudging his friend. "That little Reyes girl, the one he was so noble about." Vince smiled, a slow, ugly twisting of his lips. "Hired her," he sneered. "That is a polite way to put it. He has been sniffing after her for months. She played him, plain and simple. Used that broken wagon and her brats to trap him. She is just a lure, a whore with a good story. And he fell for it." The rumor took root, a poison that began to spread back through the town. Clara knew nothing of this. She only knew the work. One morning, Toma found her walking toward the spring house, a heavy bucket in each hand. "You need to learn to ride," he said, stopping her. "I do not know how," she said, startled. "If there is trouble," he said, his eyes scanning the hills, "you will need to ride. The children will need to ride." He led her to the corral, where his own horse stood, saddled. He did not put her on the horse. He unfastened a rein. "You start here. You must know the knots." He held up the leather strap. "This is a safety knot. It holds tight, but you can free it with one pull. If a man falls and is dragged, this knot saves his life." He showed her, his large, dark hands looping the leather with practiced speed. "Now you." She tried, her fingers so deft with a needle, fumbled with the thick, oiled leather. She could not make the loop hold. "No," he said, his voice patient. He stepped closer. He stood just behind her, not touching, but she could feel the heat radiating from his body. The wind was still, and she could hear his breath. His arm came around her, his hand covering hers, guiding her fingers. "The loop goes under," he said, his voice low, almost in her ear. "Then through itself, here." His hand was hard and warm over hers, the same way it had been on the iron linchpin. He moved her fingers, forcing the leather into place. "Now pull!" She pulled. The knot held fast. "Good," he said. He did not step away. She was entirely surrounded by his presence. She stared at the knot, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was aware of his chest, inches from her back, the scent of sage and horse and clean leather. He stepped back, and the air rushed into the space between them. She looked up at him. His dark eyes met hers, and there was no hiding the intensity in them. It was not the look of a boss or a protector. It was the look of a man. It was full of the same respect he had shown her hands in the churchyard, but it was mixed with something new, something deeper and more dangerous. He held her gaze for a beat longer, then broke it, nodding to the knot. "Again," he said, his voice all business once more. That evening, Clara stood on the porch, watching the 4 children chase a lizard near the steps. Rosa came out and handed her a cup of steaming, bitter tea. She nodded at Clara, a clear sign of acceptance. Clara looked out at the ranch, at the strong fences, at the orderly storeroom she now commanded, at the firelight glowing from the window. She knew what the town must be saying about her. She knew the whispers that would follow her. But here, she had a clean room, full bellies for her children, and work that mattered. She saw Toma on the far fence line, a dark shape against the red sunset, watching his herds. She thought, a house is not built with money. It is built with a way of life everyone can lean on. She was leaning on it. and she was helping to build it. The order Clara established in the pantry spread. It moved into the main house, then to the cookhouse, and finally, even to the bunkhouse. She had started a ledger. It was a thick book, bound in cheap leather, that she had bought with her own money in her first week. In this book, she wrote down every sack of flour, every pound of coffee, every twist of tobacco, and every box of cartridges. When one of the cowboys needed something from the store, he had to come to her. She would retrieve the item and write it in the ledger, and the man would make his mark beside the entry. At first, the men were sullen. They were used to taking what they needed. One of them, a tall rider named Jed, had grumbled, "You countin' our bullets, girl." Clara had looked at him, her gaze level, holding the charcoal pencil. "I am not, Jed. I am counting Mr. Nantan's bullets, so I know when to order more, so you do not ride out one morning and find the box empty." The logic was unassailable. Toma Nantan, when he saw the book, had studied it for a long time. He looked at her neat columns, the careful accounting of his wealth. He made his own mark in it, for a box of shells, and handed the book back. He had said nothing, but his approval was a silent, solid presence. It was this ledger that forced her back to San Miguel. After a month at the ranch, her columns showed that the flour was low, as was the salt and the kerosene. Toma was busy tracking a small group of stray cattle that had been missed in the last roundup, the same group rumored to have been bothered by the night comets. He could not go to town. "You will take the main wagon," he told her, not as a question. He handed her a small leather pouch. It was heavy with coin. "Rosa will ride with you. Luis may go. The other children stay here." Clara had not been back to town since the day she left. The thought of it made her stomach clench. But she looked at the pouch, at the trust it represented. She was not the laundry girl running from the preacher. She was the steward of the Rancho Nantan, on her employer's business. She nodded. "I will leave after the morning lessons." The drive to town was quiet. Rosa sat beside her on the wagon bench, her rifle resting across her lap, her eyes scanning the hills. Luis sat in the back, excited to be on an adventure. When they pulled onto the main street of San Miguel, every head turned. The sight of the Nantan wagon was common. The sight of Clara Reyes driving it, with the formidable Rosa as her guard, was a sensation. Clara kept her eyes forward, pulling the wagon to a neat stop outside the mercantile. She ignored the whispers, the pointed fingers. She was here to work. She stepped down, her boots hitting the dusty street. She was wearing a new dress, a practical brown cotton she had sewn for herself from the ranch's stores, noting the fabric used in her ledger. She was thinner than when she left, but she stood straighter. "I will be back," she said to Rosa. Rosa nodded, her gaze never leaving the street. Clara walked into the store. The proprietor, Mr. Gable, stopped stacking tins. His wife looked up from her needlework. "Good morning, Mr. Gable," Clara said, her voice clear. "I have a list from the Rancho Nantan." She placed the paper on the counter. "Mr." Gable looked at the list, then at her. "Miss Reyes, we did not know you were employed out there." "I am the house steward," Clara said simply. "Clara, is that you?" The voice was like glass breaking. Celia Marsh stood by the fabric counter, a bolt of yellow silk in her hands. She had not been in the store when Clara entered. She looked Clara up and down, her eyes sharp and assessing. The thin, scared girl was gone. This was someone new, and Celia did not like it. "My," Celia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You have done well for yourself. It seems our Apache rancher enjoys rescuing things." Clara felt the blood rush to her face. She looked at Celia. She remembered the shawl in the dust. She remembered Toma's hand on hers, showing her the knot. She would not let this woman cheapen that. "Good morning, Miss Marsh," Clara said, her voice quiet but cold. She turned back to the storekeeper. "I will need 10 sacks of flour, Mr. Gable, and 50 pounds of salt. Please add it to Mr. Nantan's account." Celia was furious at being dismissed. She stepped forward, her silk dress rustling. "You must be very comfortable out there. He is quite wealthy, I hear. It must be a relief. After that, Havel, you lived in—" She leaned in, her voice a conspiratorial whisper that all the store could hear. "Tell me, does he make you work hard for your keep?" The implication was ugly and unmistakable. Clara went very still. She did not answer. She simply held Celia's gaze. She did not flush. She did not look away. She just waited, letting Celia's ugliness hang in the air, exposed and sour. "Celia." "Mrs." Gable said, her voice sharp with embarrassment. "That is enough." "I am merely making conversation," Celia snapped. "Well," another voice said. It was the preacher, standing by the door. "It seems a fine morning for honest work, Miss Reyes." He had been listening. He nodded to her, the same nod he had given in the churchyard. "Mrs." Gable put down her sewing. "Clara," she said, and it was the first time she had used her name with such softness. "That ointment you made for my son's rash last winter, the one with the comfrey, it was the only thing that gave him relief. I was wondering, do you still gather herbs?" The tension in the store broke. Celia, isolated, turned red. She saw the storekeeper weighing her father's influence against Toma Nantan's business. She saw the gratitude in Mrs. Gable's face and the respect in the preacher's. She was suddenly on the wrong side of the opinion she so desperately ruled. "I am busy," Celia said, throwing the silk bolt onto the counter. "I will come back when the store is not so crowded." She swept out, leaving a trail of angry silence. Clara let out a slow breath. She looked at Mrs. Gable. "I still gather them. Yes, I will bring some on my next trip." Across the street, in the saloon, Vince Malloy watched the entire exchange. He saw Clara, calm and dignified. He saw Celia storm out. He watched as Mr. Gable himself helped load the heavy sacks onto the Nantan wagon. He turned back to the 3 men at his table. They were hard-luck cases, riders who had been fired from other ranches, men with nothing to lose. Vince had been buying them whiskey for an hour. "You see that?" Vince sneered, gesturing with his glass. "That is what he replaced me with. A laundry girl who plays lady. He is soft. Nantan is sitting on 1,000 head of cattle, and he is letting that girl and his Apache cook run his house. He is distracted." "He is not soft, Vince," one of the men muttered, nervous. "He is Apache, and his riders are loyal." "His riders are stretched thin," Vince said, his voice low and persuasive. "The night comets are running them ragged down south. They are all watching Dry Creek. They are not watching the North Pasture. The North Pasture is full of his best stock." He leaned in. "We do not have to be the night comets. We just have to be smart. A quick raid. 100 head. We can be in Mexico before he even knows they are gone." He smiled, a humorless expression. "A big job," he said, raising his glass, "to teaching Mr. Nantan a lesson." The other men, their eyes greedy, raised their glasses. Clara, Rosa, and Luis returned to the ranch as the sun was setting. The day's victory in the mercantile faded as a strange tension settled over the compound. The men were quiet, watchful. Toma was on the porch, cleaning his rifle, his movements economical and precise. "There was a sign," he said to Rosa in Apache. Rosa stiffened. "What?" "On the north fence, a chalk mark, and shod hoof prints. 3 riders. They were probing." Clara did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. "What is wrong?" "Trouble," Rosa said, her hand going to the rifle on the wagon. That night, the ranch did not sleep. Toma posted 2 extra guards. The bunkhouse was silent. In the main house, Clara put the children to bed, but she did not undress. She sat in the main room, listening. Rosa sat across from her, her face grim. It happened around 2 in the morning. It was not a gunshot, it was a scream, a horse, terrified. Then the sound of the entire herd in the main corral. 200 horses suddenly panicked, thundering against the heavy wooden rails. "They are trying to spook them," a man shouted from the dark. "They are trying to stampede the horses." Toma was already out the door, his rifle in his hand. "Hold the line!" he roared into the night. "They are a diversion, do not chase." Gunfire erupted, flashes of orange in the blackness, aimed high to scare the herd. In the house, Clara's fear was a cold knot, but her mind was clear. This was not a social slight. This was an attack. "Luis!" she yelled. "Nakai, get the children! The root cellar! Now!" The 4 children, wide-eyed with terror, scrambled from their beds. Luis, his face pale but set, grabbed Marisol's hand. Nakai grabbed Taza. They ran to the heavy trap door in the pantry that led to the cool, dark cellar. "Rosa, the water buckets," Clara commanded. The 2 women worked as a single unit, filling every bucket from the kitchen cistern, placing them by the doors in case of fire. "The lamps," Rosa said, and Clara moved, extinguishing every light, plunging the house into darkness. The last thing she did was go to the heavy plank doors, front and back. She dropped the thick iron crossbars into their brackets. The sound of the bars sliding home was a solid, defiant thud. They were sealed in, safe. Clara and Rosa stood in the dark kitchen, listening to the chaos outside, the sound of shouting, the crack of rifles, the terrible, panicked screaming of the horses. Then, as quickly as it began, it faded. The riders were gone. The sounds moved east, into the hills, as Toma's men chased the probe away, but only far enough to secure the boundary. An hour later, the men returned. Clara heard Toma's boots on the porch. She pulled the heavy bar back. He entered, his face dark with sweat and anger, his rifle smoking. His men were behind him. He looked around the dark kitchen. He saw the empty children's beds. He saw the buckets of water. He saw the bar she had just lifted. He looked at Clara and Rosa, standing together by the hearth. His gaze rested on Clara. She was trembling, her hands clasped, but she was unharmed. He turned to his men, who were breathing heavily. "The house was secure," he said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "Miss Reyes held the house. No one was harmed." It was not praise. It was a statement of fact. But to the cowboys, it was a redefinition. She was not the laundry girl. She was not the boss's woman. She was the person who bolted the door and protected the children. She was part of the ranch's defense. The men nodded, their expressions of suspicion replaced with a new, grudging respect. Clara did not sleep for the rest of the night. She sat by the hearth, the children safe in their beds, her body shaking with the adrenaline that had finally worn off. Rosa came and sat beside her. The older woman did not speak for a long time. Then she reached out and put a mug of her hot, bitter tea into Clara's hands. Clara's fingers were so cold she could barely feel the heat. "You are good in a fight," Rosa said quietly. "You did not panic. You have a strong heart." Clara looked at her, and the last wall of suspicion between the 2 women crumbled. They were the heart of the house, and they had held. The next day, a strange calm settled on the ranch. It was the quiet of a held breath. Toma knew the probe was just a test. The real attack was coming. Clara, trying to restore order, went to the pantry. The men had been in and out, grabbing jerky and coffee during the excitement, and the shelves were a mess. She was trying to lift a new 100-pound sack of flour onto the bottom shelf when it snagged. Toma entered the pantry behind her. He had come for the ledger. He saw her struggling. He did not ask if she needed help. He simply stepped forward. "Move," he said. She stepped back. He grasped the heavy sack, his muscles flexing under his shirt, and lifted it as if it were a pillow, placing it easily on the shelf. As he set it down, His arm brushed hers. It was an accident, just a grazing of his sleeve against her bare forearm. But the contact was electric, a jolt of warmth and strength. It was the touch on the wagon pin. It was the hand over hers on the leather knot. She looked up at him. He was looking down at her, his dark eyes intense. The pantry was small and cool, and suddenly it was airless. The circle of trust that had started in the dust of the churchyard and been forged at the wagon wheel was now complete. He was not just her boss. She was not just his steward. They were two people holding a line against the chaos. He broke the gaze first, clearing his throat. He picked up the ledger from her desk. He walked to the north pasture, his horse moving at a steady gait. He found what he was afraid of, the tracks of the three riders. One of the horses had a distinctive chip in its left front shoe. He would remember that. And on the main gatepost, gleaming white, was a fresh chalk mark, an X, a target. They had marked the pasture. They had tested the defenses. He looked out over his herd. He looked back toward the house, where Clara was teaching the children on the porch. "They are coming back," he said to the wind. "And they are coming soon." The ranch held its breath for 3 days. The chalk mark on the north pasture gate was a white scar, a promise of violence. Toma Nantan moved his men, shifting their sleeping patterns, doubling the watch. The horses were kept in the main corral, close to the house, their nervous energy a tangible thing in the air. In the main building, Clara felt the tension as a tightening in her own chest. She, too, made preparations. She ensured the root cellar was stocked with water and blankets. She sharpened the kitchen knives, at Toma's instruction. She helped Luis and Nakai build a signal pyre on the small rise behind the cookhouse, a high, dry pile of mesquite and brush. "If they come in force," Toma had told her, his voice low, "and I am not here. You light this, it will be seen in the valley." He had looked at her, his gaze holding hers. "You understand?" "I understand," she had said. The children, sensing the fear of the adults, were quiet and pale. They did not play. They stayed close to the kitchen, where the fire burned and Clara's presence was a steadying force. The attack came on the night of the empty moon. The sky was a black velvet void, starless, windless. The silence itself was an agony. It was 2 a.m, the hour when the soul is at its lowest ebb. A single sound broke the night, the sharp crack of a heavy wooden rail splitting. It was followed by a human scream, high and wild, and then a chorus of them, yelps and shouts designed to terrorize. A half-dozen rifles fired at once, the bullets whistling high over the rooftops, aimed not to kill but to panic. The cattle in the north pasture, a herd of 500, bellowed as one, a deep, earth-shaking sound of terror. The fence was down. The rustlers were upon them. Toma Nantan was on the porch before the first echo died. He was already armed, his boots on. "Jed!" he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. "The creek bed, take 3 men torches. Hold them at the narrows. Fire high. Turn them back. Do not let them scatter." His men poured from the bunkhouse, rifles in hand, pulling on boots as they ran. "The rest of you, with me," Toma yelled. "We hold the main herd. Whistle, use the whistle." He ran for his horse, already saddled at the rail. This was the outer line. This was the battle for the cattle. Inside? Clara moved just as fast. The inner line was hers. "The cellar!" she screamed at the children. "Now all of you, Luis, get the blankets." The 4 children, who had been sleeping in their clothes, scrambled from their beds. Rosa, her face grim, grabbed her rifle from the wall and the heavy bar for the front door. "The stores!" Clara, Rosa yelled. Clara knew. She ran to the pantry, her ledger room. This was the ranch's magazine. Ammunition, rifles, supplies. She grabbed the heavy iron key from the hook and locked the thick plank door. She slid the deadbolt. Whatever happened, the attackers would not rearm themselves from Toma's own stores. She ran back to the kitchen. Luis was herding a crying Taza toward the trap door. Nakai, his face set, followed. Marisol was last. her eyes huge with terror. "Go, go," Clara urged. Marisol stumbled on the top step, dropping the small cloth doll Clara had made for her. It fell into the dark cellar. She cried out and scrambled down after it. Clara turned to Rosa. "Get him bar it from the inside." "I stay," Rosa said, leveling the rifle at the door. "You will not. The children need you." Clara shoved the older woman, with a strength she did not know she possessed, toward the cellar. "Go!" Rosa, seeing the iron in Clara's eyes, obeyed. She disappeared into the dark. Clara slammed the heavy trapdoor shut and dropped the thick iron bar over it, sealing them in. Now she was alone in the dark house. The noise outside was a war. The thunder of hooves was deafening. It sounded like the herd was splitting, some being driven by Toma's men, but others, a large group, breaking free, stampeding directly toward the ranch compound. The signal fire. Clara grabbed a burning branch from the hearth. She unbarred the back door and ran into the night. She was met by chaos. A dozen steers, maddened with fear, were crashing through the yard, their horns hooking, their eyes white. She dodged them, her heart in her throat, and scrambled up the small rise to the pyre. She thrust the burning branch into the dry tinder. The brush caught instantly. A whoosh of flame shot 20 feet into the black sky. A sudden, brilliant torch that lit the entire valley. She had done it. She had warned the neighbors. She turned to run back to the house and froze. The trapdoor to the cellar was open, and Marisol was standing beside it, her doll clutched in her hand. She had slipped back out, unnoticed by Rosa in the dark, to retrieve her toy. Now she stood, paralyzed by the sight of the stampede, a wall of dark shapes and flashing horns bearing down on the house. "Marisol!" Clara screamed. Clara did not think. She ran. She launched herself from the small hill, sliding in the gravel, and flew across the yard. She grabbed her sister, pulling her small body against her, just as the first steer hit the porch, splintering the wood. Clara fell backward, shielding Marisol with her own body. She looked up and saw a massive steer, its head low, charging directly at them. There was no time to move. She closed her eyes and held her sister, bracing for the impact. A shadow moved, faster than death. Toma Nantan, his face a mask of fury, wheeled his dark bay horse between her and the steer. The horse reared, screaming, taking the brunt of the impact on its shoulder. The steer, deflected, crashed into the wall of the house. "Get up!" Toma roared at her. "Get to the house!" But Clara was staring, not at him, but at the cattle. They were terrified, running blindly, a river of panic. They were being funneled by the house on one side and the bunkhouse on the other, heading for the open, broken gate of the main corral. She saw her chance, her skills, the skills of a mending woman, a laundress, a cook, rose up in her. "The bell!" she screamed at Luis, who was staring, horrified, from the cellar entrance. "The dinner bell, ring it!" Luis vanished. A second later, the heavy iron bell on the porch began to clang, a deafening, familiar sound that cut through the bellowing. It was the sound of food, the sound of routine. The lead steers, confused, paused. Clara scrambled to her feet, dragging Marisol. She ran to the line where she and Rosa had left the water buckets. She grabbed a heavy wool blanket, soaked it in a bucket, and ran back into the path of the cattle. "Clara, no!" Toma shouted. She ignored him. She swung the heavy, wet blanket, snapping it in the air. Crack it sounded like a pistol shot. "Ha ha, get back!" she screamed, her voice raw. She was not a cowboy, but she was a woman who had shooed chickens and stubborn mules. She was the woman who had faced down Celia Marsh. She snapped the blanket again. Crack! She rang the bell. She was noise and fury. The lead steer, confused by the bell, frightened by the snapping blanket, turned away from the broken gate and the open plains, and veered toward the one place that seemed safe, the high, solid walls of the horse corral. its gate still standing open. The rest of the strays followed, a wave of dark bodies. Clara, aided by Luis, who was now ringing the bell wildly, hazed the last of them, nearly 50 head, into the horse corral. Nakai, seeing the plan, darted out and slammed the heavy gates shut, dropping the bar. It was done. They were safe. The yard was suddenly, shockingly, quiet. Nantan. The voice came from the darkness, full of venom and rage. A single rider sat on a black horse just outside the light of the signal fire. "You are finished." "Apache," the man shouted. He rode forward, his rifle raised. The firelight caught his face. It was Vince Malloy. "Your fences are down. My men are running your herd," he spat, his face twisted with triumph. "I told you I would have my due. I am taking everything you own." He saw Clara then, standing by the corral, covered in mud and dust, her sister clinging to her. Malloy's eyes widened, and his smile became something terrible. "And I will take her, too. I will take that mending whore you are so proud of." He raised his rifle, aiming it directly at Clara. Clara heard a click beside her. Toma Nantan sat on his horse, his own rifle leveled, the barrel rock steady, aimed at Vince Malloy's chest. The two men were frozen, a perfect tableau of hatred in the firelight. Vince laughed. "You shoot me. Your herd is gone. My men have their orders. You give up. I might let you live." Toma did not speak. He had been trained to shoot from the back of a moving horse since he was a boy. He could hit a running rabbit at 100 yards. He had Vince Malloy dead. To pull the trigger was to end the threat, to avenge the insult, to deliver justice. But he was not an executioner. He was a rancher. He lowered his aim by 6 inches. He fired. The shot was deafening. Vince Malloy did not fall, but his horse did. The animal screamed, a terrible sound, and collapsed, its front legs shattered. Vince was thrown clear, but his leg was trapped under the horse's weight, his rifle skittering away into the dirt. "No!" Vince screamed, his voice breaking in pain and fury. From the darkness, 3 other riders appeared. They saw their leader down, his horse shot. They saw the ranch house, dark and fortified. They saw the signal fire blazing on the hill, calling the entire valley. They saw Toma's men, Jed and the others, now riding back from the creek bed, their torches held high. The main herd saved. The attack was broken. The probe had failed. The 3 riders wheeled their horses as one and vanished into the night. The battle was over. The only sounds were the pained groans of Vince Malloy and the lowing of the cattle, safe in the corral. Clara was shaking. Her legs gave out, and she sat down hard in the dust, pulling Marisol into her lap. She was alive. They were all alive. Toma Nantan dismounted. He walked slowly toward Vince Malloy, his rifle still held loosely in his hand. He stopped, looking down at the man who had tried to ruin him. Then he turned his head. He looked across the yard at Clara. She was covered in grime, her hair plastered to her face, her dress torn. She was trembling like a leaf in a high wind, but she was not crying. She was holding her sister, and she was staring back at him, her eyes dark and wide in the firelight. He looked at the locked storeroom. He looked at the blazing signal fire. He looked at the 50 head of cattle safe in the horse corral. He looked at the wet blanket she had dropped. He did not need to speak. She saw it in his eyes. He knew that if she had not been there, the house would have fallen, the ranch would have been lost. She held his gaze, and for the first time in her life, she did not look away. She had earned her place. She was standing, even while sitting. The sun came up on a scene of wreckage. The signal fire on the hill was a column of greasy black smoke. The yard was a ruin of shattered porch rails, spent shell casings, and dark, drying pools of blood from the dead horse. Vince Malloy was tied to the main corral gate, his groans a low, steady rhythm of pain. His leg was bent at an angle that made Clara feel sick. The adrenaline of the night had passed, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. But there was no time for rest. Clara emerged from the house, her face pale but her eyes clear. She looked at the devastation, at the 50 head of cattle safe in the horse corral, and her first thought was coffee. She checked the children, who were huddled in the kitchen, wide-eyed and silent. Rosa was already there, her face a grim mask, stoking the fire. Clara went to the pantry. Her pantry unlocked the door and took out the coffee. She began to brew a pot large enough for 10 men. Outside, Toma Nantan was moving with a grim, focused energy. He had 2 men guarding Malloy. He dispatched 2 more. One rider, on the fastest horse, was sent south on the long 2-day ride to Tucson to fetch the county sheriff. The second rider was sent to the neighboring ranches. By 7 in the morning, the neighbors began to arrive. Drawn by the signal fire, they were hard men, ranchers who understood the law of the border. They rode in, their rifles ready, and stopped, taking in the scene. They saw the dead horse. They saw the tracks of the stampede. They saw the cattle Clara had saved, and they saw Vince Malloy tied to the gate. "That's him," one of the ranchers said. Dismounting, he knelt by Malloy's dead horse. "I saw this track, the chipped shoe. He was one of the 3 who probed my line last week." "It was the night comets," Toma said. It was not a guess. "Malloy led them." The ranchers nodded. This was the proof they needed. The Association of Ranchers had its own laws. Faster than any sheriff, they would see him hang. "We need to get him to town," Toma said. "To the marshal. Let the law be seen." The decision was made. They would transport Malloy to the small marshal's office in San Miguel to be held for the county sheriff. Clara heard the decision, and her stomach tightened. She had to go. The ranch was out of salt pork, and the raid had destroyed half their water barrels. She was the steward. It was her job. They made a strange procession. Toma rode in the lead, his face like carved stone. His cowboys, armed to the teeth, rode as guards. In the center, Vince Malloy was slung over a horse, his hands tied, his broken leg causing him to curse and groan with every step. Clara drove the main supply wagon, with Rosa beside her, rifle across her lap. When they hit the main street of San Miguel, the town stopped. News had already flown in, a garbled story of a massive raid and a heroic defense. The entire population was in the street. They saw the armed riders. They saw the notorious rancher, and they saw Vince Malloy, a captured rustler. A cheer went up from some, but mostly there was a stunned, fearful silence. This was border violence, brought into their street. They stopped in the main square, in front of the marshal's office. The marshal, a man named Bean, who was known to be friendly with the mayor, came out, his face pale. Then Clara saw her, Celia Marsh, standing on the boardwalk in front of the mercantile. Her father, the mayor, was beside her. Celia's face was not pleased. It was white with fury. The capture of Vince Malloy was not a victory to her. It was a scandal, a low, dirty brawl that had splattered mud on the town's good name, and she knew exactly who to blame. As Toma dismounted and began to untie Malloy, Celia stepped forward, her voice, high and clear, cut across the square. "This is what happens," she cried, pointing not at Vince, but at Clara, sitting on the wagon seat. "This is the chaos you bring." The crowd turned, confused. "We were a peaceful town." Celia's voice was ringing with righteous anger. "We had no rustlers, no gunfights in the yard. Not until she came. She brought her bad luck, her poverty. She brought the churchyard brawl, and now she has brought a war to our doorstep." A murmur went through the crowd. They were superstitious people. They looked at Clara, the outsider, the girl who had lived in the dirt behind the tannery. Maybe it was true. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She was back in the churchyard, the shawl in the dust. She wanted to shrink, to disappear. The crowd looked at Toma Nantan, waiting. But it was not Toma who spoke. "The girl is not bad luck. The voice was rough, accented. Rosa had climbed down from the wagon. She stood in the dust, her rifle held at her side. The girl is the iron bar on the door. She is the water bucket for the fire. She locked the stores when the bullets came. She saved the children. The crowd stared at the old Apache woman. She is right, a new voice said. Jed, the cowboy who had once mocked her, stepped forward, his hat in his hands. I saw it, Miss Reyes. She stood in front of 50 head of stampeding cattle. She turned them with a wet blanket and the dinner bell. She saved the herd we got. That ain't bad luck. That is sand, more sand than I seen in most men. Amen to that, the preacher said, stepping out from the crowd. He looked at Celia. I have seen this woman bear insults with grace. Miss Marsh. And now I hear she has faced violence with a courage that saved a household. Perhaps the Lord is trying to teach us what real value looks like. The tide of the crowd, so quick to turn, turned again. They were looking at Celia now, their expressions hardening. Celia was trapped. She had been publicly contradicted by a servant, a cowboy, and a man of God. She looked to her father, but the mayor was a politician. He saw the way the wind was blowing. He remained silent, his face a mask. Toma Nantan had not said a word. He finished tying Malloy's hands and handed the rope to the marshal. Then he turned. He faced the crowd. He faced Celia Marsh. His voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the square. This house, he said, and everyone knew he meant his ranch, his home. It stands this morning because of her. He did not look at Clara. He looked at the people who had judged her. She is the steward of my home. She is the keeper of the hearth. No one. His eyes finally moved, locking onto Celia Marsh. Has the right to shame a woman who guards the fire. No one. The silence was absolute. He had not just defended her. He had given her a title. He had placed her at the center of his world. Celia Marsh, for the second time, had been publicly defeated by him. Her face was a terrible sight. Without a word, she turned and walked away, her back rigid. The mayor gave Toma a single, cold look of appraisal, a look that promised this was not over, and followed his daughter. The spell was broken. The truth had been spoken in the daylight. People began to talk, to nod. They looked at Clara on the wagon seat with a new, profound respect. Clara barely heard it. She was trembling. She had been saved again. But this time, it felt different. It felt like she had been saved by the truth. They returned to the ranch. The rest of the day was a blur of work, mending fences, counting the remaining stock, barricading the broken porch. Clara worked until her hands were numb. She restocked the pantry. She updated the ledger. She cleaned the mud and blood from the porch. She worked because if she stopped, she would have to think. That evening, the ranch was quiet. The children were asleep. The cowboys exhausted in their bunks. Clara was alone in the kitchen, scrubbing the last pot, when Toma Nantan entered. He stood in the doorway, watching her. She did not look up. You are safe now, he said. Am I? She asked, her voice low. She stopped scrubbing. Or am I just yours? He frowned. What do you mean? She turned to face him, her hands dripping soapy water. The internal conflict, the one she had been holding back, finally burst free. In the town square, you claimed me, like the shawl. You protected me. I am grateful, Mr. Nantan. But I cannot live on your gratitude. I cannot be the girl the Apache defended. I cannot be the keeper of your hearth, if it is just a name you give me. The town will always whisper. They will say what Vince Malloy said, that I am just kept. She was terrified. She had spoken out of turn. She had challenged the man who owned everything, the man who had just saved her life. Toma looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a new expression on his face. He was not angry. He was not confused. He understood. He understood that her dignity was as important to her as her life. He had saved her life from Malloy, but he had not saved her dignity from the whispers. He had to give her something more than his protection. He had to give her power. He walked past her, to the small desk in the corner where she kept her ledger. He lit a lamp, pulled out a clean sheet of paper, and dipped a pen in the inkwell. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "The town," he said, his back to her, "respects paper. It is the white man's way, a contract." He began to write. His hand, so strong on a rifle or a rope, moved carefully, forming the letters. He was not a learned man, but he was precise. He wrote a contract of employment. He listed her duties: steward of the Rancho Nantan, manager of all household stores, supplies, and ledgers, educator of the 4 children Luis Reyes, Marisol Reyes, Nakai Nantan, and Taza Nantan. He listed her payment $30 coin, United States currency, per month, paid on the 1st, and full room and board for herself and her family, Luis and Marisol Reyes. He finished writing and turned, the paper in his hand. He placed it on the kitchen table in front of her. "This is not a gift, Miss Reyes," he said, his voice formal. "This is an agreement. Your work has value. Your position is earned. This paper is the proof, not my word, not my protection, your signature." Clara stared at the paper. A contract, a legal document. It was everything she had wanted, spoken in the only language the world would understand. It silenced the whispers. It made her his equal in business, not his ward. Her hand was shaking. She looked from the paper to his face. You would do this." "Sign it," he said. She picked up the pen. Her fingers were stiff and raw from the lye and the scrubbing. She bent over the table and, in a clear, careful hand, she wrote her name at the bottom, Clara Reyes. She set the pen down. She had not breathed. He reached out, not for the paper, but for the small bottle of blotting sand. As he shook the sand onto her signature, his hand, large and dark, covered hers. It was not an accident. It was a deliberate, quiet touch. His skin was warm, calloused, and strong against her own. She did not pull away. He did not pull away. They stood there, their hands touching on the contract, the only sound the pounding of her heart in her ears. The air in the kitchen was thick. He was looking at her, his dark eyes intense, and she saw in them everything he could not say. The respect, the admiration, and something else, something deeper, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He lifted his hand slowly, breaking the contact. She pulled her hand back, folding it with her other. They had kept the proper distance, but a line had been crossed, signed, and sealed. The contract, signed and sanded, lay on the kitchen table. It was a shield, but Clara knew, with a cold certainty, that the war was not over. The physical attack had failed. The social attack had been turned back. But the source of the hatred, the cold fury in Celia Marsh's eyes and the calculating silence of her father, remained. They had won the battle in the square, but the political structure of San Miguel was untouched. The next 2 days were spent in a whirlwind of labor. Toma Nantan, with his men and 2 neighbors, rode the boundaries, rebuilding the fences, their hammers ringing in the cold air. They found the main herd, scattered but mostly safe, turned back by Jed's torches at the creek bed. The ranch had held. In the house, Clara and Rosa worked to erase the signs of the attack. They scrubbed the porch, though the splintered wood remained. Clara, with her ledger and a fresh supply of coin from Toma, organized a supply run to a neighboring ranch, bypassing San Miguel entirely. She bought lumber, nails, and water barrels. She was the quartermaster of a small, healing army. The children, seeing the adults at work, found their footing. Luis and Nakai were given the job of restacking the firewood. Marisol and Taza, too small to haul, were tasked with gathering all the spent shell casings. They presented their bucketful of brass to Toma, who nodded gravely, as if they had delivered a crucial report. On the third day, riders were spotted on the road from town. It was not a posse of neighbors. It was Marshal Behan, and with him were two deputies, riding beside them. His face set in a mask of official gravity was Mayor Marsh. Toma met them in the yard. He had been shoeing a horse, and he did not put down his hammer. "Marshal," he said, his voice flat, "the sheriff from Tucson is not due for another day." "I am aware," Behan said. He looked uncomfortable. He would not meet Toma's eye. "We are not here about the raid, Mr. Nantan." "Then state your business," Toma said. Mayor Marsh moved his horse forward. "Our business, Nantan, is with the integrity of this territory. A formal accusation has been lodged. It is alleged that you have been stockpiling illicit goods, that you have been trading with rustlers, perhaps even with the night comets themselves." Toma's hand tightened on the hammer. He stared at the mayor, the silence in the yard stretching thin. "That is a lie," he said. "Is it?" the mayor asked, his voice smooth. "You are a wealthy man. You have vast stores. Vince Malloy, the man who led the raid, was your employee for nearly 2 years. Is it not possible this raid was simply a business arrangement gone sour, a falling out among thieves?" The accusation was brilliant in its wickedness. It twisted Toma's own defense against him. It painted him as a criminal, and the raid as mere infighting. "I have a warrant," Marshal Behan said, holding up a paper. "Signed by Judge Riley, on the mayor's authority. We are here to search your stores." Toma looked at the paper, then at the mayor. He saw Celia's hand in this. This was her final, vicious move. If she could not beat him, she would ruin him. "You will find nothing," Toma said. "We will see." The mayor dismounted, gesturing to the deputies. "The main storeroom, now." Clara had been watching from the kitchen window, her heart a cold stone. She saw the men walking toward her pantry, her domain. She saw the smug, confident look on the mayor's face. She did not wait. She picked up the ledger, and her box of receipts from the mercantile. She walked out of the house, her contract in her apron pocket. "Marshal," she said, her voice clear and carrying. The men stopped. "Miss Reyes," the mayor said, with a thin, mocking smile. "The new steward. The one who appeared from nowhere. How convenient. Perhaps you can show us where your employer keeps his stolen goods." Clara ignored him. She looked directly at Marshal Behan. "Marshal, you are here to search the stores. I am in charge of the stores. I have the inventory. You will find everything is in order." She walked to the pantry door, unlocked it, and swung it open. The mayor and the deputies stepped inside. They were met not with chaos, not with hidden crates or mismatched goods, but with perfect, meticulous order. Sacks were stacked, tins were labeled, and the room was scrubbed clean. "As you can see," Clara said, opening her ledger on a barrelhead, "we are low on flour, having just received 10 sacks from Mr. Gable on Monday. Here is his receipt. We have 12 pounds of coffee remaining. We have 6 tins of kerosene. We have 20 boxes of .44 caliber ammunition." "20 boxes," the mayor exclaimed. "That is a stockpile." "It is our allotment for the month," Clara said, her voice unwavering. "As you can see in the ledger, we used 3 boxes during the raid, which I noted here." She pointed to the entry. "You will find 17 full boxes, and 1 opened box with 3 cartridges missing. Would you like to count them?" "Mayor." The mayor's face began to turn a dull red. The 2 deputies looked at each other, one hiding a smile. "What about those barrels in the corner?" the mayor snapped, pointing. "That is salt pork, delivered from the Double H Ranch 2 days ago, to replace what was lost when our barrels were broken. Here," she said, producing another paper, "is the bill of lading, signed by Mr. Henderson himself." She stood there, calm and immovable, her book in her hand. She met every accusation with a fact. She defeated his warrant not with a gun, but with arithmetic, The order she had built, the meticulous care she took with her work, was a shield of iron. The marshal, his face full of a new, deep respect, closed his own notebook. "Mayor," he said, "there is nothing here. This is the best-kept storeroom in the territory. There is not a single item unaccounted for." "This proves nothing," the mayor sputtered. "It is just paper, his word against—" "My word is my bond." Toma's voice was low. He had sent Nakai on a fast pony when the riders first arrived. Now, an older Apache man was dismounting. He was a man of great age, his face a map of deep lines, his presence radiating an authority that dwarfed the mayor's. He was an elder of their clan. Toma stood beside him. "Marshal?" Toma said, "This is my uncle. He is the keeper of our family's honor. I have asked him to be a witness." Toma spoke to the elder in Apache. The old man's eyes, bright and black, rested on Mayor Marsh. He looked at him, up and down, as if he were a spoiled child. Then he spoke, his voice a dry rattle. Toma translated. "My uncle says our people do not need paper to prove their honor. Our honor is held by our family. If I were a thief, if I were a liar, I would not be permitted to speak for my people. I would not be permitted to raise my brother's sons. My name would be salt in the mouths of my kin." He asks. Toma's eyes drilled into the mayor. "Who holds your honor?" Mayor Marsh was beaten. He was speechless. He had been defeated by a woman's ledger and an old man's integrity. He had come with the power of the white man's law, and he had been turned back by something older and stronger. This is an outrage," he stammered. He turned to the marshal. "We are leaving." Marshal Bien looked at Toma. "My apologies, Mr. Nantan." He nodded to Clara. "Ma'am." He and his deputies mounted and rode out, leaving the mayor to follow. Humiliated and alone. Later that day, the marshal sat in his office. He had Vince Malloy brought from his cell. "Marsh set you up, did he not?" Bien said, lighting a cigar. "He paid you to hit Nantan." Vince, his leg propped on a stool, gave a wheezing laugh. "The mayor, he is just a politician. He talks, he does not act." "But someone in town paid you," Behan pressed. Vince smiled, a terrible, broken-toothed expression. "A man in this town paid me. Yes, paid me a lot of money to scatter Nantan's herd. A man with a lot to lose if Nantan gets too powerful. A man with a daughter who does not like to be told no." Behan stared at him. It was an accusation, but it was not proof. He could not arrest the mayor's daughter. The rumor, however, was a seed. He let it go. That night, the ranch was quiet. The moral climax had passed, and the victory was absolute. Clara finished her work and walked to the stables, the air cool and sweet with the smell of hay. The horses were quiet. She needed a moment of peace. Toma was there, in the lantern light, mending the bridle that had been broken in the raid. His strong hands worked the leather, stitching it with an awl and thread. They stood in silence for a long time, the only sound the shush of the horses in their stalls. "He will not be back," Toma said, his voice low. "I know," Clara whispered. "You beat him, not me, your book." "I just did my job," she said. She leaned against the stall, feeling the weariness of the week settle on her. I am not used to this, to being the person the mayor comes to accuse." He stopped his work. He looked at her. "You are not used to being seen," he said. She shivered, though the night was not cold. "I am afraid I will disappoint you. I am a laundry girl, Mr. Nantan. I know herbs and needles. I do not know how to be this." He put the bridle down. He stepped toward her, his shadow covering her. He stood so close she could feel the warmth from his body. "Good," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Do not be that. Be Clara, the woman who faced down Celia Marsh. The woman who faced the stampede. The woman who beat the mayor with a pencil. He reached out, his calloused fingers gentle, and brushed a piece of straw from her hair. His hand lingered, his thumb grazing her cheek. "I do not need you to change," he whispered. She looked up at him, her heart beating a painful rhythm against her ribs. She saw the respect in his eyes, the admiration, and she saw the warmth, the deep, quiet fire he kept banked within him. He saw her tremble. He stepped closer, and his arms came around her. It was not a lover's embrace. It was a shelter. He pulled her against his chest, his arms strong and solid, holding her, protecting her. He rested his chin on the top of her head. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of leather and sage and safety. He held her for 3 long heartbeats, a promise of protection, a commitment made without a single word. Then, slowly, he released her and stepped back, the boundary of propriety still respected, though forever changed. Later that night, Clara sat by the hearth. The contract was tucked in her small wooden chest. She took out her old, mended shawl. It was stiff with the grime of the raid and the dust of the churchyard. She filled a basin with warm, soapy water. Slowly, meticulously, she began to wash it. She was gentle with the patches, her mother's work and her own. She did not scrub. She rinsed, letting the dirt and the shame and the memory of Celia's sneer wash away into the gray water. She wrung it out and hung it from the wooden mantel, directly over the fire. It was no longer a symbol of her poverty. It was her history. It was the flag of her survival. It was a talisman for the house, hung at its very heart. The preacher rode out 2 days later. He found the ranch at peace. He looked at the mended fences, at the children playing in the yard. He looked at the shawl, hanging over the fire. "The town is reeling," he said, accepting a cup of coffee from Clara. "The rumor about Malloy and the mayor's family is spreading. People are shaken. They need healing. They need to come together." He looked at Toma. "We are holding a spring planting festival. Next week, a celebration of renewal. We would be honored if you would come, all of you." Toma Nantan looked at his ranch. He looked at the shawl by the fire. He looked at Clara, who stood beside him, her ledger in her hand. "If the house stands," Toma said, "we will stand with it." The week leading up to the spring planting festival was one of bright, clear days and a nervous energy. The rumor of what had happened in Toma Nantan's storeroom, the story of the ledger and the elder, had spread through San Miguel just as fast as the story of the raid. Mayor Marsh had not been seen in public. Celia Marsh was, according to town gossip, in a state of confined fury. When the day of the festival arrived, the sun was warm for the first time in months. It was a true spring day, a promise of renewal. The main square of San Miguel, which had been a place of dust, judgment, and fear, was transformed. Bunting was strung between the buildings. Tables groaned with food-smoked hams, fresh-baked bread, pies, and lemonade. A fiddler and a banjo player were tuning up on a small wooden platform. The Nantan wagon rolled into town at midday. It was not the armed procession of the week before. It was a family. Toma drove, his face clean-shaven, his black hair tied back with a clean leather thong. He wore his best shirt. Beside him sat Clara. She, too, had prepared. She wore the brown cotton dress she had made, freshly laundered and pressed, and over her shoulders, she wore the shawl. It was the same mended, patched wool, but it was no longer a badge of shame, and it was not a flag of war. She had washed it clean of the raid's grime. It was just hers. It was her history, and she wore it in the daylight without apology. Her dark hair was neatly brushed and tied at the nape of her neck. She held her head high, her eyes clear. In the back of the wagon, the 4 children were scrubbed and shining, their laughter a bright, tumbling sound. Luis and Nakai, now inseparable, were arguing over a pocket knife. Marisol, her cough long gone, was showing Taza how to braid a piece of grass. Rosa, in the seat behind Clara, watched over them, her rifle still present, but cased and stowed. As they stopped the wagon and dismounted, a silence fell over the festival. It was not the hostile silence of the churchyard. It was a silence of curiosity, of awkwardness, of a town that knew it was in the wrong and did not know how to make amends. Clara felt the stares, but she did not flinch. She helped Marisol down from the wagon. The preacher was the first to move. He walked toward them, his hands open. "Mr. Nantan, Miss Reyes, we are so glad you came." Then Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, bustled over, her face wreathed in a nervous smile. "Clara," she said, her voice warm, "the children they are beautiful." She pressed a small, sugary biscuit into Marisol's hand. A rancher from the south, the man who had recognized Vince Malloy's horse track, approached Toma. He did not shake his hand, but he gave a deep, respectful nod. "Nantan, good to see you." One by one, the people who had looked away, who had whispered, now stepped forward. A nod here, a shy curtsy from a woman there. A man touched the brim of his hat. It was a clumsy, disjointed, but sincere apology. The town was shifting its allegiance. They were moving, as a group, away from the shadow of the mayor's power and toward the solid, proven integrity of the Nantan ranch. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest. She had not come seeking their approval. She had only come to stand with the house, as Toma had said. But their respect, freely given, was a balm on old wounds. The music started, a fast, cheerful reel, and the children ran off toward the tables, their laughter joining the celebration. The moment was too much for one person to bear. "Well, well, look what the wind blew in." Celia Marsh stood on the boardwalk, a glass of lemonade in her hand. She had not been defeated. She had been waiting. She was dressed in brilliant yellow, a stark contrast to the homespun crowd. Her eyes were bright with a feverish, contained hatred. She strolled toward Clara, her gaze sliding over the mended shawl. "It is amazing what a little money can do," she said, her voice light, but carrying. "The laundry girl cleans up quite well. A pet project can look almost presentable, can it not?" The music seemed to falter. The crowd went still, caught in the familiar drama. Clara felt the old, cold dread, the automatic instinct to look down, to make herself small. Enough. The word was not loud. It was low, deep, and absolute. Toma Nantan had moved. He was not standing beside Clara. He was standing slightly in front of her, a solid wall between her and Celia. He looked down at the mayor's daughter. He was not angry. He was finished. Celia laughed, a high, nervous sound. "I am just making an observation. Mr. Nantan, surely you do not mind if so—" "I do," he said. The crowd pressed in, listening. Toma Nantan looked away from Celia, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the townsfolk, the ranchers, the wives, the preacher. He was making a formal declaration. "This is not a game," he said, his voice resonating with a quiet power. "And she is not my project." His hand moved, not to touch Clara, but to gesture toward her. "She is the heart of the Rancho Nantan," he said. "She is the steward who saved my stock. She is the woman who held my home against an armed attack. Without her," his eyes found the preacher, then Mrs. Gable, "I would not be standing this way." It was a full, public, and undeniable statement of her value. He was not her protector. He was her partner. He was giving her the credit, in front of the world. The town let out a collective breath. It was over. The social reign of Celia Marsh was broken. She stared at Toma, her face pale, her mouth open. She saw in the eyes of the crowd that she had no more power. They were not looking at her. They were looking at Clara, with open admiration. Celia put her glass down on the table, her hands shaking. She turned, without another word, and walked away. This time, no one followed her. She was just a woman in a yellow dress, walking alone. A moment later, the fiddler, sensing the shift, struck up a new tune, a gentle, slow waltz. The tension was broken, and the festival resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. It was lighter. A man approached Clara, clearing his throat. It was the doctor, the one who had yelled at her from his window. He held his hat in his hands, his face a mixture of embarrassment and business. "Miss Reyes," he said, I owe you an apology for that night." "It is forgotten, Doctor," Clara said quietly. "No," he insisted. "It is not, but I am here on business as well. I have heard, well, Mrs. Gable has spoken of your poultices, and Marshal Bean has spoken at great length about your organizational skills." He pointed to her ledger, which she had, out of habit, brought with her in the wagon. "I need herbs for my apothecary," the doctor said, his voice quick and professional. "A regular supply, but I need them bundled, weighed, and, well, I need them accounted for. I have seen your work for Mr. Nantan. I would like to offer you a contract, a standing order, paid monthly, for all the sage, comfrey, and feverfew you can gather. A business arrangement." Clara stared at him. A second contract. One from the ranch, one from the town. This was not a gift. It was not charity. It was her own work, her own skill, valued in the open market. This was her independence. "I would be happy to discuss the terms, Doctor," she said, her voice steady. From the marshal's office, 2 deputies emerged, leading a horse. Vince Malloy, his leg in a crude splint, was lifted into the saddle. The county sheriff, a tall man with a grim face, had arrived. He took the reins. "He goes to Tucson," the marshal said to the crowd. "He will stand trial for rustling and attempted murder." Toma Nantan watched them go. He turned to the marshal, the others the night comets. "Scattered to the wind," the marshal said, spitting. "Malloy was the brains. With him gone, they are just dust. The threat is over. Nantan, the valley is safe." The physical danger was gone. The social danger was gone. The financial danger was gone. Clara stood in the square, the sun on her face, and felt, for the first time in her life, a sense of profound, unshakable peace. The fiddle music was soft. The children were laughing, their mouths stained with berries. Rosa was sitting on a bench, talking quietly with Mrs. Gable, a rare, small smile on her face. Toma Nantan turned to Clara. He stood in front of her for a long moment, the noise of the festival fading around them. He did not speak. He simply held out his hand. It was a question. Clara looked at his hand, the same hand that had lifted her shawl from the dust, the hand that had guided hers on the wagon pin, on the leather knot, on the contract. She placed her hand in his. He led her onto the cleared patch of ground that served as the dance floor. His other hand rested gently, properly, on her waist. Her hand rested on his shoulder. They began to move, slowly, to the rhythm of the waltz. They were not elegant dancers. He was a rancher. She was a steward. But they moved together perfectly. They did not speak. They did not need to. The entire town watched. They saw the Apache rancher and the laundry girl, but they did not see a scandal. They saw 2 people who had stood together against chaos and won. They saw the heart of the Nantan ranch. They saw a home. Clara looked up at Toma's face. He was looking down at her, his dark eyes no longer guarded, but open and warm. She did not see her boss. She saw the man who had seen her when she was invisible. The song ended, but they did not let go. The waltz ended, but the echo of the music remained. Clara Reyes and Toma Nantan stood in the center of the town square, his hand still on her waist, her hand still on his shoulder. They were no longer the town's scandal. They were its new, quiet center of gravity. He released her slowly. with a respect that was as intimate as a kiss. He nodded, once, and led her back to the wagon, where the children were waiting, their pockets full of sweets, their faces bright with exhaustion. The ride back to the Rancho Nantan was the opposite of the journey she had made weeks before, a desperate woman carrying a sick child. Now, she sat on the wagon bench, her back straight. The children, Luis and Nakai, Taza and Marisol, fell asleep in a tangle of arms and legs in the wagon bed. A single, unified family. Rosa sat beside them, her rifle cased, her eyes closed, but not in fear. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. It was a rhythm of peace, but also of purpose. The shattered porch was rebuilt, the new lumber a lighter, cleaner color than the old wood. The fences were stronger than before. Clara's world expanded. She was no longer just the steward of the house. She was a woman of business. Twice a week, she rode the mule wagon, not the borrowed, broken-down cart, but the solid Nantan wagon, into the foothills. She gathered her herbs, and the children helped, their hands learning the difference between comfrey and sage. She delivered her bundles to the doctor, who paid her in coin. As per their contract, she took that money, her own money, and bought new boots for Luis and a thick, warm coat for Marisol, the one she had dreamed of. Her journey was a quiet miracle. She had walked into San Miguel as a girl defined by what she had lost. She was the orphan, the laundress, the woman in the mended shawl. She was the one to be pitied and scorned. Now, she was defined by what she had built. She was the steward, the contract holder, the woman who had turned a stampede. She sometimes looked at the small, heavy linchpin she had kept from that night on the road. She held it in her hand, remembering the feel of his hand covering hers, guiding her. From that one small point of contact, that one repaired wheel, a new house had been built, a house with strong foundations, a house whose hearth she guarded, not because she was a servant, but because she was its heart. The future did not arrive with a thunderclap or a wedding bell. It arrived one evening on the porch, in the quiet of the desert dusk. The drought that had been threatening all spring was now a reality. The air was dry, and the creek was low. Toma had spent the day with his men, planning new routes to high pasture grass. He came and sat in the chair beside her. They watched the 4 children playing a game of tag in the dust of the yard, their laughter sharp and clear. He did not turn to her. He spoke to the horizon. The summer will be hard. The grazing will be thin. We will manage, she said. I have put aside double the stores of beans and flour. The men will not go hungry. He nodded. He had known she would. They are good children, he said, gesturing to the yard. Luis is a fine boy. He teaches Nakai well. Taza teaches Marisol to be brave, Clara said, a small smile touching her lips. They are a family, he said. It was a statement of fact. He turned his head and looked at her. His dark eyes were serious. We will raise them. Together. It was not a proposal. It was not a plea. It was a contract, spoken in the language of work and responsibility. It was a promise to face the hard summer, and all the seasons after it, as one. Yes, Clara whispered. We will. The town was healing, too. The wound of Celia's bitterness and her father's corruption had been exposed to the light, and now it began to close. The mayor, it was said, was planning to move east. Celia was rarely seen. The town, left to its own devices, found its conscience. The preacher came to the ranch one Sunday, not for a sermon, but for a visit. You have changed us, Miss Reyes, he said, accepting a cup of water. And you, Mr. Nantan. He told them that Vince Malloy had been tried in Tucson. The testimony from the other ranchers, combined with Marshal Behan's report, had been overwhelming. Malloy had been sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. Justice had been served, cold and clean, without a rope or a mob. Toma's choice to shoot the horse, not the man, had been the right one. It had let the law stand. "The town has taken on a project," the preacher said, a small, proud smile on his face. "The old wagon bridge at the north gate, the one that washed out every spring, they are rebuilding it with solid oak." Toma raised an eyebrow. "The town is paying for this." "The people are," the preacher said. "Mr. Gable from the Mercantile. Even the doctor. They are calling it the Hearth Bridge. After the words you spoke in the square, a reminder," he said, looking at Clara, "that a community is also a house, and it must be guarded." It was a sign. The people of San Miguel were learning to respect the quiet honor of the Apache way, personified in Toma. They were learning to see value not in silk dresses, but in strong foundations. That night, Clara went to her room. The new moon silence of the desert pressed against the windows. The house was safe. The ranch was at peace. She took her mended shawl, now clean and soft from the hook where it hung. She folded it with care, her fingers tracing the old, familiar stitches, her mother's work and her own. It was her past, her hardship, her resilience. She placed it in the bottom of the new wooden chest Toma had built for her. Then she took out her small, locked box. Inside it was her contract of employment, the paper that had beaten a mare. She placed the contract on top of the shawl. The two items, one defining her past, one defining her future. Lay together, they were the two pillars of her dignity. Weeks later, the drought had deepened. The moon was a sliver of bone in a black sky. The cattle were restless. Toma came to her after the children were asleep. "Ride with me," he said. "The north fence. I heard a coyote." She saddled her own horse, the one he had taught her to ride. They rode out together, not as boss and steward, but as partners. The desert was vast and silent, awash in silver starlight. They were two small, warm figures in a cold, immense world. They reached the north fence line. He dismounted and she held the reins. He lit a lantern, the small, bright flame pushing back the dark. "Hold this," he said. She dismounted and took the lantern, holding it high so he could check the tension of the wire. The light illuminated his strong hands as he worked. A gust of wind, dry and cold, swept down from the mesas. It made the lantern swing. She reached out with her other hand to steady it. Her hand, chapped and strong, covered his. His work stilled. Their hands were together on the warm tin, a mirror of the night at the wagon wheel. A spark from the lantern's chimney was caught by the wind and thrown into the dark, a single, brief ember. Clara looked up. He was already looking at her. The light was between them, illuminating his face. She saw his honor. She saw his strength. She saw his home. And her heart, quiet and steady, followed. He did not break the gaze. He looked past her, to the dark, empty line of the southern horizon. "The preacher told me the surveyors are finished," he said, his voice a low rumble in the vast silence. "They are building the railroad. It will come through this valley." Clara followed his gaze. A new challenge, a new iron world was coming to change their land, to test their home. But she was not afraid. She stood in the desert night, her hand on his, her value proven, her place earned. She was seen, and she was standing tall. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would love to connect with you. Please comment below and let us know where in the world you are listening from. And share your thoughts on Clara and Toma's journey. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales, and like this video. If you enjoyed this story, please support us by pressing the hype button so that this story can be heard by even more people.